The Reluctant Healing One. If you've been following along in this Oak Leaves series, you know that we have introduced the main characters from Chapter 1, the childhood years, and Chapter 2, the teenage years. These are the parts of me, the ones that together tell the story of how this little acorn, the self, has grown over time into the oak tree that now stands in the world. These are the parts that make up the oak tree that I am. The full tree that today shows up with presence and power, and also the quiet, invisible layers of wounds, hurt, trauma, and subsequent trauma responses of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and faint that shaped its growth. This also represents the healing parts of my tree that now allows me to create impact, to offer shade, to hold space for others in ways it once needed for itself. It begins by turning inward, by meeting these parts, witnessing them, understanding them, and gently unburdening what they've been carrying, often for decades or most of our lives. These are the parts that inherited unprocessed generational wounds from our lineage, the imprints formed through our environments and conditioning, and the very real events that occurred as we moved through life. All of it lives within us, shaping how we respond, how we protect, and how we show up. This happens because these individual parts develop a job to do once they're impacted, to create protections so that the wounded part never gets wounded again. They don't know time has passed, so they stay stuck in their individual wounds and imprints, and they use different responses to that trauma to protect what is deeply exiled inside them, until they can be witnessed and released. This entire series explores this inner landscape through the lens of IFS, internal family systems, the life-changing modality developed over 40 years ago by Dr. Richard Schwartz. Today, his work stands alongside the contributions of fellow pioneers Dr. Gabor Mate and Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, whose collective research has deepened our understanding of how trauma is not just remembered, it's embodied. What you're reading in this series is not theory alone. It is the integration of that work with my own lived experience and decades of study across clinical psychology, spiritual and somatic practices, Kabbalistic teachings, Stoic philosophy, and even disciplines like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. This series is my attempt to bring in all of that together, not as a framework you must learn first, but as a story you can feel into. Each part is introduced not as a concept, but as a character, because that is how we experience them. Distinct voices, distinct reactions, even distinct ways of moving through the world. And through their stories, my hope is that you begin to recognize your own, to gently uncover, unpack, and ultimately unburden the parts of you that may still be holding you back from the expansion, peace, and inner alignment you know is possible. This is the foundation of what I now call Living Oak Leadership. It's built on the metaphor that an acorn does not begin as something separate from the tree. It is born from it, already influenced by the rings of growth that came before. The oak tree carries within it decades, sometimes centuries, of environmental conditions, storms weathered, seasons endured. And before the acorn ever touches the ground, it already holds within it the imprint of that history. So it is with us. We are shaped not only by what happens in our lifetime, but what came before us, what surrounded us, and what we made those experiences mean. This is the baseline of our story. And while it may seem unusual to pause here to offer an introduction in the middle of an unfolding narrative, but this moment matters. Because when we now step into Chapter 3, the young adult years, I want you to understand not only what you're about to witness, but why it matters. So let's recap. Up until now, you've been meeting the earliest imprints of the story. The younger leaves, the first began forming long before I ever understood that they were shaping how I would move through the world. You met 3-year-old Curly, the frozen one, who learned in a single moment that when life becomes overwhelming, the safest response is to shut down, to freeze, to go still in the face of something too big to process. Then came 5-year-old Lil Blue, the knowing one, who came into this world deeply connected to her voice and purpose, and who learned to fight when that voice wasn't honored, not from aggression, but from a deep inner certainty that she was meant to be seen and heard. Moving on, we witnessed 8-year-old Snowbird, the confused and grieving one, who experienced a loss too early to understand and in the absence of language or support learned to fawn, to become what others needed in order to stay safe and not abandoned. After that, we got introduced to 10-year-old Opie, the unseen and excluded one, who experienced rejection in a way that disconnected her entirely from her body, defaulting to a lifetime of fainting, leaving her body in order to survive what she couldn't emotionally hold. Then, chapter 2, came the teenage years. 12-year-old Huffy, the spiritual one, who felt deeply connected to something greater, but also learned to fawn in order to maintain safety and belonging in a world that didn't always understand that connection. Then came 15-year-old Cougar, the victim one, who oscillated between fight and flight when trying to find footing in a world where she misunderstood and overpowered authority when she had no sovereignty. After her, we saw 17-year-old Boss, the responsible one, who carried the weight of everything and everyone, learning to balance fighting and freezing, standing strong when she saw injustice and no adults doing the right thing, but left her judged, publicly shamed, and outcast. These were the first 2 chapters of the story, the early growth rings of the oak tree, each one shaped by moments that left an imprint, each one adapting in real time to survive what was happening. Now we arrive at a different kind of moment. This is where we meet 20-year-old Yellow Mellow, the reluctant healing one. She's different from the others, not because her experiences are any less painful, but because this is the first time life didn't just imprint a response, it invited a reckoning. Yellow Mellow left home for college 2 years earlier. She was in college 6 hours away from everything she'd ever known. What should have been a normal life transition was anything but that. On the surface, it looked like everything was normal, but underneath it, there was a quiet fracture already forming. Her parents were in the middle of a divorce. Her 2 younger sisters were still at home, and for the first time in her life, she is physically removed from the role she had unconsciously taken on, the one who had held everything together for everyone. What happens next is not one event, it's a series of them. While she was away trying to navigate a new life, she loses 2 of her best friends in tragic car accidents. The kind of loss that doesn't feel real at first because it isn't supposed to happen this early in life, and not this suddenly. She experiences her first serious relationship and the heartbreak that comes with it, all while quietly battling an eating disorder, body dysmorphia, and an obsessive relationship with exercise that has become less about health and more about control. And still, she performs. She works 2 jobs. She carries a full course load. She makes Dean's List. From the outside, it looks like she's thriving. She's doing everything right. But internally, she's holding together a system that's already overloaded. This is what so many high-functioning leaders understand intimately, the ability to perform at a high level while something inside is slowly breaking. Until the day it finally does. No warning sign that anyone else can see, but her body starts to give out. Severe illness and the mental toll of a raging eating disorder overcoming every aspect of her inner life. For the first time in her life, after waking up on the floor of her dorm room from a passed-out vodka binge, instead of adapting, instead of pushing through, instead of performing, she does something none of the earlier parts could do. She calls home, and she asks for help. That moment changes everything. It leads her first to a hospitalization for severe mono that affected her lymph nodes so severely she could not breathe for days. Then immediately after to a 30-day inpatient eating disorder facility called the Meadows. And while the experience itself is difficult, it marks the beginning of something new. Not perfection, not strength, but awareness. For the first time, she begins to see that what she's been doing is not just discipline or drive, it's a response, a pattern, a way of coping with something that was never fully processed. When she leaves the facility, she's not fixed. She's not suddenly confident or whole. She is still fragile, still cautious, still trying to understand how to exist in a world that no longer feels entirely safe. But she's beginning to rebuild. Through the support of friends, through a 12-step program, through small, intentional steps, she starts reintegrating into life again, this time with a different level of awareness about herself. And for a brief moment, it feels like maybe, just maybe, things are stabilizing. Until another moment reshapes everything. She attends a party with friends she's known her whole life. It is familiar, comfortable, and supposed to be safe. But by the end of that night, her sense of personal space, safety, and sovereignty is violated. She is harassed and physically overpowered by someone older, someone who assumes access to her without permission. She questions and blames herself for even being out in the world and away from the safety of the Meadow Rehab Hospital. Wearing a yellow skirt she would never normally wear. That must have been the reason, she tells herself. This was the formation of Yellow Meadow. The inner questions that quietly reinforce the idea that her safety was somehow her responsibility to manage, and her failure to do so is the reason it happened. These moments, for this part, do not just hurt, they create deep imprints. It teaches her something at a very deep level, that even when you try to do everything right, you are still not guaranteed safety. And from that belief, she begins to turn on more flight and freeze responses to life's triggers. She began to fear her own expansion because showing up fully, being seen, taking up space, started to feel like something that could lead to loss and trauma again. Not just emotional loss, but physical, personal, and deeply violating loss. This is also the part of me that became hyper-aware of relapse, not just into an eating disorder, but into losing control of myself. Control had become synonymous with safety, and anything that threatened that control felt dangerous. And perhaps most quietly, this is the part of me that began to keep real relationships at a distance, because intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like exposure, like an open door to something being taken again. This is where the Living Oak leadership model becomes real, because what this story shows is not just that a sequence of difficult events, it reveals a pattern. And from those experiences, we developed, as previously mentioned, various default trauma responses to our lives, not as flaws, but as adaptive strategies that help us survive in these moments. But until they are witnessed and released, they will drive us unconsciously forever. The challenge is that when these moments are not fully processed, the body remembers, the mind reinforces, and the response becomes automatic, showing up again and again in situations that feel similar, even if they're not the same. But here's the turning point. The power is not in eliminating these parts or these responses. It's in uncovering them. Because when you can begin to see the moment the imprint was formed, plus the pattern it created, plus the response it wired into your system, you create space for something new. You create space for self. This is the foundation of Living Oak leadership. The understanding that when we uncover our internal imprints and the patterns they created, we are no longer unconsciously driven by them. We can begin to lead ourselves and ultimately others from a place of conscious power rather than unconscious reaction. Yellow Meadow was never weak. She was the first version of me who became aware that something needed to change, even if she didn't know yet how to do it. She stepped onto the path of healing, not because she felt ready, but because something in her knew she couldn't keep living the same way. And even then, she did it cautiously, reluctantly, with one foot still rooted in protection. And maybe that's the part of the story that matters most. Because healing does not begin when you feel strong. It begins when you're willing to see what is true, even if it scares you. And the moment you begin to see it, to name it, to understand it, is the moment you begin to take your power back. And that is how our individual oak tree continues to grow, not by avoiding the storms, but by understanding the rings they leave behind.